Hello everyone, my name is Neil McCormack and welcome to my VFX workshop tutorial. Today we're going to be doing some concept art using sci-fi concept art using 3D and some Photoshop painting after. So basically what we're going to be using here specifically is Lightwave 3D and Photoshop, but the techniques and the theory behind it means you can really use any 3D program, whatever you have, doesn't really matter, to do the scene. So it doesn't necessarily specifically have to be the same program I'm using. But okay, so let's get started. So the first thing generally I'm going to do is set up my scene in 3D. So I need to organize my display ports just to get everything in the correct place, and then just to figure out the basics of the scene, where the camera is going to be, what composition I want to work with. Generally I would use landscape format, especially for environments, which is what I'm going to be doing. So minimum's 4K resolution generally, although I probably work at 50% of that today, just to speed things up a bit. And then I'm going to set my camera options to real lens camera, which choose a Canon lens. Nothing, doesn't really matter at this stage what you're choosing, but I generally find that that works for me. So play about, see what works for you. These are just my options. So now I'm just going to be working to scale. When you're working in environments, it's always better to work to the correct scale of how big you think things are going to be. So obviously I'm going to grid square size 150 meters as I want to create a large environment. So let's just try to find a good camera position. Low down makes it slightly more dramatic maybe. And then we'll just try to position the camera where I think it might be good. Just making sure all my options are set for rendering and enabling my global illumination and my radiosity bounce lights. We'll discuss that later. And reducing the ambient light, so we're just generally using one light source, which in our case would be the sun. And then let's try to just position that somewhere just about there. Doesn't really matter, I suppose. We can go through and obviously change these options later once we know where our background and our light source and stuff. So okay, so let's start creating our environment. So I'm just going to create a basic box which we're going to deform into some landscape. So I'm going to make it about that size, 13 kilometers. Again, trying to work in real world scales rather than meters or millimeters. It's just going to be too complicated. So now we need to add some polygons, subdividing the mesh. Generally when working like this, the standard is the more polygons we have now, the more details we will have in the object. So as I'm going to be deforming it using image maps, it's better to work with quite a high number of polygons, as we'll get more detail in the deformation. So let's load up that into my scene, and then we'll just try to position this in a sort of good place, and we'll just change the viewport so I can see, when I apply the deformations, I can see what exactly is happening to the mesh. So sort of working in sort of real time at the moment, and then we'll go back and configure the scene and the object in the scene and where we want them to be just a little bit later. So Let's just get my viewports organized again and bring up the properties, and then add my displacement map. Just, yeah, cubic or planar, and the y-axis doesn't really matter. Automatic size. And the image I'm going to choose is actually an HDR image. But again, you can try many different images. You can try all kinds of pictures, whatever you have, just to test, just to see what happens. And it's often can produce some really kind of interesting deformations, which, you know, you let your imagination run a little bit and see what happens. So I might just have to blur the image. Not much happening at the moment, but let's just try to have a look at our image there. So sometimes if we blur the image, it just takes the pixelation out of the deformation. So let's just check that. And again, we can disable that if we don't need it. So okay, so if we up the amplitude, we can start to see the beginnings of something happening. Needs to be higher. Again, needs to be a little bit higher, but we can start to see some sort of landscape forming there. Could be interesting. Let's try to move it towards the camera so we can start to think about our composition and perspective and things like that. Just moving the camera a little bit. Okay, a little bit more maybe. Let's bump it up 150. If we invert the layer, it inverts the geometry and the deformations, but that looks looking interesting. Let's get rid of... okay, there we go. So without the blur, it's looking a lot better. It's looking a lot more interesting. Some sort of fantasy landscape or something like that. Let's just try to position this now in a good way. That could be very cool, actually. Very interesting shapes and formats. You can see the detail is quite good. We should up the deformations a little bit more, depending on the quality of your image, depending obviously on the amount of polygons in your object as well. Maybe a little bit more. Just keep testing and seeing really how it fits, if it works. Okay, that looks good. Something, always good to have something close to the camera and try and frame it up a little bit. Position the light a little bit. Let's just go through this, see what works. Okay, we'll settle for 250, I think. And then we can try to move this around, try and position it correctly until we're happy with where it stands. Obviously we're going to need more than one of these in our scene, so I'm probably going to clone it and reposition it a little bit more, maybe flip the axis on it to mirror the object. Let's just inverting it also produces something. You can see the deformations are now underground. If we move the camera down, again, could be interesting, but not today. No, it's really about trying to visualize where you want this to be and what you think it could turn into, and I'm just now gonna save this transformed object as its own separate 3D object. So if I save trans, then we can reload it back into the scene, and we don't need to do the deformations on it because it's already deformed. So it gives us something else to play with. So if I load that back in, and we have our second instance, and we can remove the original. So that just now leaves us one object with no displacement and no deformations on it. So it's going to be a lot easier to work with and a lot quicker at render time as well. So I think that's going to work a lot better. Let's just try to... Okay, let's make a clone. And let's go through our scene setup again and position these in a little bit, trying to build up the landscape, trying to find a nice composition. Again, that could be interesting. It's about trying to find some middle ground, some foreground and some background, trying to keep the eye interested in what it's looking at. So it's always got a focal point, but there's always something to try and draw it in with. Framing up the image naturally with landscapes is a good way to do that. And as this is sci-fi, we can pretty much do whatever we want. As long as the composition and the theory behind it is working, then there's no reason why it shouldn't work. So if I just stretch that up slightly, some sort of far peak that could be a tower, it could be a castle, a rampart or something. Let's just work with these two for now, maybe. If we open up the actual model. So this is our original transformed model that we saved. So you can see the number of polygons. I'm just going to mirror it. So we've got the displacement on the other side of the image. So then I'm going to save that as a separate object, copy it, and then paste it into a new one. So we haven't touched the original, we've simply mirrored it and copied it as a new object, and then we can then load that back into our scene and use that. I'm getting the idea that this could be on the left side with the other model on the right side, and set the scene up this way. So if we synchronize that over, and there's our third. Let's just scale out. There we go. So this is our third object. And sometimes it's nice just to have a little variation in the scene. So, okay, it's going to take a while just to try and get everything in the right place, just to try and figure out. So let's work on that for a little bit and see what we can come up with.